Remember, you are this universe, and this universe is you. Remember, all is in motion. Isn't that true? Everything is in motion, us, the world, and so change is all around us. I was thinking about how when I was growing up, at this time of year, we would be gearing up in elementary school to mark Columbus Day, with coloring pages of Christopher Columbus and his ships for the second Monday in October, and whatever complexity anyone involved might have felt about what had happened to the people who were already living here when he landed was easily pushed aside for us to learn this important history lesson. But of course, tomorrow, most of us, I dare say all of us, will not mark Columbus Day, but instead Indigenous Peoples Day, a day meant to offer a counter-narrative to the story of Christopher Columbus as a hero and discoverer, heavy air quotes, and uplift both the historical genocide and contemporary lives and culture of the Indigenous people of this country. Indigenous Peoples Day began as an idea in the late 1970s and had its first official commemoration via protest in 1992 in the Bay Area in California. And today, many state and local governments have chosen to declare their recognition of Indigenous Peoples Day, though it is not a federal holiday, as Columbus Day was not. It's one tiny piece of how the dominant narrative around the relationship between colonial forces and Indigenous people they sought to erase has shifted, just within my lifetime. And so this Indigenous Peoples Day, as we see the narrative of progress backsliding all around us, you are perhaps shocked to learn that the federal government will not be making an Indigenous Peoples Day declaration this year. Whoa. I enjoy the combination of like fake shock and boo, which I feel like really sums up how I'm feeling about the federal government right now. Right? So I am extending, in the face of that backslide that we see all around us, I want to extend an invitation for us to consider not only what we have to learn from our Indigenous neighbors, but also what we have to learn from the story that has been told and the stories we have been told and will tell about how we have come to this present moment. Stories like how Danae's great-great-grandmother was kidnapped from her family and forcibly assimilated, and how so many others were too. And the millions of other untold stories that have been buried under time and fear and the fight to survive. But surfacing historical stories to deepen our engagement with a topic does not always go the way we hope it will. Sometimes when we engage more deeply with history, we learn a narrative that does not always cast us in the best light. I grew up Unitarian Universalist, and so my childhood was spent learning about heroes of historical Unitarianism and Universalism. People, right, we did coloring sheets of them too. And the narrative I was taught and that I told myself for many years is that, right, these are the real heroes, not that Christopher Columbus nonsense. Like, oh, I'm learning about the real heroes of social justice in history. But of course, anytime you put a cape on someone in history, you might learn things about them someday. You will learn that the people who bore your name or your identity were not always on the right side. One of the lessons for me in Unitarian and Universalist history that was the hardest to sort of stomach in terms of my self-concept is that throughout my childhood, right, crusaders for women's rights were lifted up in historic Unitarian and Universalist communities. We were told that like the suffragettes were our ancestors and their cause was righteous and they were amazing and we should be grateful for them and we should color in little pictures of people like Susan B. Anthony. But not everything about the early women's rights movement reflects our values today. It was complicated when I learned, the first time I had the thought, oh my God, Susan B. Anthony was a racist. I thought about the time in Sunday school in the 1990s in my Unitarian church when we had baked her a birthday cake. And I thought about how could all of this coexist together? And I talked just a couple weeks ago, I think, about how historically Universalists were people who were deeply engaged in the social movements of their time, movements like what we call temperance, which was the movement to abolish alcohol in the United States. And I was recently reading a book about feminist history, and I came across this quote from Frances Willard, proto-lesbian heroine of women's history, and president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was a hotbed of Universalist and Unitarian historical activism. And this is what she had to say about who the problem drinkers in our country were. Alien illiterates rule our cities today. The saloon is their palace, the toddy stick their scepter. Better whiskey and more of it has been the rallying cry of the great dark-faced mobs of the southern localities. Woe is right. But I am still here. I did not declare that Unitarians and Universalists must be irredeemably racist because they had these people in their history. Something has kept me here, and it's been this question. How can we have self-concepts, right, identities? How can we think of ourselves, both as individual people in our families and our cultures, and collectively as a congregation? How can we think of ourselves in a way that can sustain the reality of learning that the past was not what we thought it was? Because that kind of learning, where you think of yourself one way, you think of your identity one way, you think of your family one way, you think of your congregation one way, you think of your culture one way, and then you learn something about it that shatters that. That's not limited to learning like the heroes of social justice were not so secretly racist in the past. That happens to us all the time. And that question came up for me again because when Danae and I were first talking about this service, it was before I knew the particulars of her family's story. And after she told me about the role that residential schools had played in the decimation of her family's Indigenous culture knowledge, I said, Danae, I have to be honest with you. If you are willing to share your individual family's story, I think it would be dishonest if we didn't talk about our collective Unitarian and Universalist story. Talk about some of our ancestors whose relationship to residential schools is a little different than your family's. Both Unitarians and Universalists were majority white Christian denominations in the United States during the late 18 and early 1900s, which means that some of our faith ancestors, like most Christian denominations in the United States, supported and ran residential schools. In the American West and Midwest, that tore children from their families and forcibly converted them away from their indigenous lifeways and towards Anglo-white assimilation. Here is a brief history note about that. This is from the research done by the director of the Unitarian Universalist State Action Network in Washington State. There were 3 attempts on the part of the Unitarians to undertake educational work amongst the Indians. One mission was among the Chippewa Ojibwe in Minnesota in 1855, and that failed due to lack of funding. And in 1871, President Grant assigned to the Unitarians the responsibility of education of the Ute tribe on the reservation near White River, Colorado, that was attempted in 1885. This attempt failed as well due to not getting significant encouragement. And in 1886, the American Unitarian Association established a boarding school on the Crow Reservation in Montana called the Montana Industrial School for Indians, or Bond's Mission School, run by the Unitarian Reverend and Mrs. Henry F. Bond. And Reverend Bond himself, right, a Unitarian minister, is recorded about saying this about the Crow students at his school. They are all bright, promising boys. How such good-appearing fellows come of an ignorant, lazy, squalid, orphaned race is a constant surprise to us. I shall dread the time, if that comes, when they slip back into their abodes and leave. It's painful to hear someone who bears part of our name perpetrate so much pain and harm done by people in our collective past. And I think many of you knew about residential schools. It's not a surprise that that was a project in American history. But the fact that both its perpetrators and those harmed are all connected in our collective web of ancestors, it would be easy to get stuck here. The shame, the guilt, the horror. But we cannot rest there forever. We don't want to gloss over it, but we also can't stay in that place forever, because I will say, if our response to every historical horror perpetrated by the powers that be in the United States were to freeze, we'd be frozen for a long time. Because the story is not finished. If we freeze, it is. It stops right there, but the story is still being written. Right now, here, today. With you, and with me, and with us. And the story is still being written because we know that as long as time is moving, as long as the universe is moving, we are moving too. It's like Joey Harjo says in the poem, "You are the universe, all is in motion, is you." And so if we are in motion, then we can set a course for a different future than the past we have inherited. And part of the way we can do that is to introduce some compassion to the way we look back at the past and what has happened. And when I say look back with compassion, I do not mean we should look back and gloss over the perpetrators, or that we should look back and give I call it the man of his time excuse. He was a man of his time. She was a woman of her time. There were people who were not complete racists and xenophobes in American history. So I think we can agree that while certainly there is a level of cultural milieu that you just participate in, there is no excuse for kidnapping children from their families. So I do not mean that we will gloss over when we look back with compassion, but instead, I mean the root of the word compassion, which means to suffer with. To suffer with. You are all people, and all people are you. That's one way to describe the core value of interdependence and interconnection that undergirds so much of who we are and how we are in community together. And so when we engage our history, it is not to try to either vilify or justify the horrors that people, whether in the past of our collective past or in your individual families. Right? It is not to either vilify or justify what they did or didn't do. There's always a moment on the show Finding Your Roots with Henry Louis Gates when somebody from the South, a white person from the South, is finding out about their ancestors, and you feel the tension build, and Henry Louis Gates, the interviewer, will say something like, "One of your ancestors fought in the Civil War." And you'll see, it's like time freezes, and the white person has a panic attack until Henry Louis Gates tells them which side of the Civil War their ancestor fought on. And then they either have relief or a new panic attack about their ancestor being a Confederate soldier. But neither of those outlooks is particularly helpful, because when we are looking to either vilify or justify, we miss that what's actually at stake is our interdependence with those people in our past who have done horrible things and the peoples whose lives were shaped by them. And that rather than try to figure out whether an ancestor was good or bad, because they were, most of them, some of each, or more of one than the other, but always a mix. And so our question then is, how can we begin from a place of interconnection, of interdependence, of interrelationship? To begin from the supposition, like the song says, that it is in our nature to look out for each other. And so my invitation this Indigenous Peoples Day is to let that help you interpret the story. Not that that history is all about heroes and villains, or right and wrong, but instead a story of how we are reclaiming our interdependence, our interconnectedness, our need for one another. Now, more than ever, we need one another. May we find that story today and every day. May it be so. Amen.